for what it's worth, that's Black preaching at its finest right there. Yep. Hey, thank you for being here, and sorry for the confusion last week, because I know there was a little bit of confusion. Anytime we change dates, it's tough. So sorry for that. That's where I want to make sure we have opportunity to speak either to last week, if you missed us or you're still thinking about it, or to this week. I know this week wants us to think a little bit about call and how that's looked with prophets in the scriptures, and also how that might look in ministry today. But of course, there's also some fascinating parts about the burning bush and God's conversation with Moses. So tell me, what are these scriptures doing for you this week and last?
Well, Mike, I understood the burning bush, but I certainly got a little confused with Ezekiel, Jeremiah, and Isaiah. I could not connect with that. They seemed to me to be a little bizarre. And so I just said, I'm not sure what that's trying to tell me.
Okay.
I understood what Moses was trying to tell me, but I certainly didn't understand those.
Thank you. Thank you. Does anybody want to hop in? I mean, let's not so relegate this with turns that we miss this opportunity. Did anybody have a clear sense about or a hypothesis about what was going on in these other passages for the week? Herb, please.
Well, there's a lot of parallels in all four of those people encountering God, and it's interesting that that was an age of imminence, where these four people all spoke to or saw God, and but it's true of all the way from Noah to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and but there were a lot of parallels between these four people and how they experienced and heard God, and I understand what Tim is saying. With Moses, there's really, he's offering them hope to allow them to escape a little bit this captivity or exile. Ezekiel the same way too. He understands that they've suffered in exile in Babylon, and he offers them hope to get out. Now, Jeremiah and Isaiah, it's a little more, he's just about to bring the wrath down on them. And in Jeremiah, he doesn't even offer much room for repentance. He just says it's coming, so be ready. So there was a little differences in those, but a lot of similarities. All of them seem to see fire or something burning or lightning or something like that. And but the speaker on the film, well, he spoke right to the matter. Be ready to hear your name called and to respond. Now, all of these guys didn't necessarily respond, just step up very quickly, but they did, in the end. That was my comments, I guess.
Thank you. Yeah, I think part of what the combination here is to look at these sort of three major prophets out of the Torah, and Moses gets the longest direct conversation with God. And I think what they're trying to do is juxtapose the way people experience call and how they handle it. And of course, Jeremiah, like Moses, says, "Not me," right? What's interesting is Isaiah says, "I'll go." And I don't know about Ezekiel's enthusiasm, but that guy had to be nuts. Like when you continue to read the book, what he does with his call is essentially performance art. He lays on his side, tied up with ropes for a year, and he tied the ropes. Like when you read what he does, he's a performance artist. Isaiah and Jeremiah, ends up come to find out he's illiterate, and a scribe writes down what he says. Isaiah is high up in the aristocracy, like he's a member of the priesthood, he does a little performance art, like he walks around the city walls naked for a while to show them what's going to happen. Like you say, Moses is calling for deliverance. Ezekiel's saying, you're not going anywhere. Jeremiah's mission is to pluck up, to overthrow, to cast down, and then to build and to plant. So like 2/3 of it is negative, right? And then Moses is like the liberator. So it's interesting to see like these different calls, these different responses, these different ways of responding to call. And I don't know that they're trying to say, look, they all have something in common. Instead, I think maybe like it's really interesting to think about the variety here. That doesn't solve anything, Tim. I mean, I'm not trying to solve it. I mean, I do think it's curious to say, like, you know, why you put these two side by side, and there's some similarities, and then, but not all the way.
How do we know we're called?
It's such a great question you ask, and I'll tell you, I'm probably not a good person to ask, because if I were sitting on the commission and ministry, and somebody came in and said, I know beyond a shadow of a doubt I'm called to be a priest, I would write no on that paper. But I have met those people, and even though that's not my way of being, it doesn't mean it's invalid. I tend to be suspicious of that, because I've met people who knew they were supposed to do, and then like the fruit wasn't there, but they knew beyond a shadow of a doubt. For me, you know, like it was interesting that the call committee, when I talked to them, my sense of call was I did a bunch of other things and I just kept coming back to this. When I was teaching math, that's not where my head was. That's not even where my heart was. So I just kept coming back. But, you know, I've met colleagues who said, I can't do anything but this. And my response was like, boy, I could do a whole lot of other things, but I keep coming back to this. And it's not like one's right and one's wrong. We're looking at four people's different way of processing that, you know, and I think that's an interesting thing. How do we know? I mean, I guess it depends really how you're wired. I don't feel like I know anything, even though I've got lots of opinions and some of them are really strong. You know, I always have a little bit of doubt.
I think that's a challenge for us. We're in our age, we're dealing with a transcendent God who's is not standing in a burning bush and talking to us. And so prayer and discernment and being ready for the call and trying to maintain a close relationship with God is about all we can do to know, you know, when we're being called.
But I do wonder about that, Herb. I mean, you know, like, so I grew up, and I don't know if you guys have heard this word, dispensationalism. Dispensationalism means that God acts in different ways during different times in history. So there's like the dispensation of the law and the dispensation of grace. And I've always kind of struggled with that, because that would mean like God changes the deal. And so like, I wonder, sometimes we read the story and we're like, oh, God doesn't do that anymore. But I mean, maybe God hasn't changed, just the way we perceive God has changed. I don't know. Like I struggle with that a little bit, because it's really hard for me to think that, hey, God used to go talk audibly to people and God doesn't do that anymore. It's sort of like, well, maybe it's because of the way we view God that doesn't seem to happen for us. Or, you know, maybe this is like a mystical experience Moses has. And look, there aren't a lot of mystics, but there are some, and they continue to have like conversations with God, you know, and like, I'm not a mystic, like I'm real skeptical, but I've had conversations with God that seemed like God was talking to me. It wasn't like God was saying like, hey, you better diversify your investment portfolio. But I've had God say like, why do you get to choose what's best for those other people? And I didn't feel like it came from me. I felt like it came from outside of me. And then I've heard the voice of God, honestly, like out of somebody else's mouth before, in a discrete segment. Because as the conversation continued, I heard them. I don't know if that makes sense. I think part of it is like, what are we comfortable with saying comes from God and what comes from other from other people.
Well, if you read St. John of the Cross, do you think he communicated with God?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think he did like Moses, right? Like, did he hear an external auditory voice? He might have heard that. Was there that voice? I don't think so. I don't know if that makes sense. I can hear a strong voice that seemed like it was coming from outside. Did it really come from outside? I'm kind of skeptical about that. I don't know if that makes sense. But those are the experiences of mystics. And, you know, one thing that is easy to miss, and Herb mentioned this, I mean, all three of these guys, outside of Moses particularly, they have a particular kind of mystical experience that even has a name. It's called Merkava mysticism. A Merkava is a chariot. And you really see it in Ezekiel when Ezekiel sees a wheel and a wheel and a wheel and a wheel. And it's called, like, the Merkava is called God's throne chariot. So it's the idea, you know, we've talked about in the ancient world, gods had like territorial bounds and the people are in exile. In some ways, Ezekiel's vision is saying like God's chariot has traveled with the people so that they're not outside of God's jurisdiction. They're not alone, but God's throne moves with God's people. And these Merkava mysticism, St. Paul has some of this too, always envisions like a lightning chrysolite ceiling separating earth and heaven. You notice that there's always like these like, I shouldn't say always, but in Isaiah and Ezekiel, you see these like superhuman beings. So like in Ezekiel, there's the four-faced beings covered with eyeballs. By the way, those are cherubim. All right, so cherubim aren't angels. That's Raphael's idea. A cherub has the face of an eagle, a lion, an ox, and a human. They're pointed in all the compass rose points, and they're covered with eyeballs. And that's like not pretty. That's like horrific to try to depict that, right? So when you think of cherubs, you want to think of that. And for what it's worth, we've transferred that in the church. Like Matthew is depicted by the lion, and John's the eagle, and Luke's the ox, and Mark's the human face. And anytime you see a gospel book, you may see those four faces representing the four gospelers, and it comes back to Ezekiel. In Isaiah, they're not cherubs, they're seraphs, right? Seraphs, which a lot of us are like, what's that? Seraphim means burning ones. So it seems like they're always on fire. It's the same root as the word serpent. So really, you should probably imagine a flying snake that's on fire that has three pair of wings, one that covers its face, one that covers its genitals. The word feet is a euphemism in the Hebrew Bible more often than not for genitals, and then two with which it flies. And you can see that if you know anything about medicine. The doctors assemble as two snakes on a pole. That's an ancient symbol of like healing, immortality, and wisdom. It shows up in shrines for Serapion or Asclepius. And again, it's still the medical symbol because a snake sheds its skin and rejuvenates itself. Is the idea, right? And so that iconography shows up in the Bible. So like, again, when you think about like meta beings, like extraordinary, like angels, don't think they're humanoid. Like they're not humanoid at all. They're like monstrous looking, flying, burning snakes or four-faced things covered with eyeballs. Anyway, that's Merkava mysticism.
Would you tell us the faces and match them up with the apostles again?
Yeah, so there's the eagle face, and that's John, right? Because John has the eagle view. John's the most like, what do I want to say? He does the most theology about what all this means, right? And then there's the lion, which is Matthew. The human face is Mark, and Luke is the ox. And there's a lot of tradition to that, and there's some like keys in terms of like what they're doing and why those get their faces. But really all of that is coming back to Ezekiel's vision. And I don't know if you've ever heard of the Baal Shem Tov, or you've heard of the Jewish sect called Kabbalah.
Yes.
So the Kabbalah is based on a book called the Zohar, founded by the Baal Shem Tov, that's Lord of the Good Name, like in the 1100s. And that's Jewish mysticism. And what do you know? It also has a Merkava in it, like a throne chariot. And like there's a division between earth and heaven that looks a lot like lightning or diamonds. Like you see that happen. If you read the book of Revelation, you'll see all those precious gemstones as well. So there's seems to be this very typical experience in mysticism where people transport to like the heavenly plane, but the thing they always do is they come back, and the experience in the heavenly plane is supposed to actually make them more grounded on earth. Now Moses doesn't have the Merkava experience. He talks to a burning bush that doesn't go out. And I don't know if you noticed in the text, what's interesting is first it's an angel in the bush, but then it's God in the bush. And God looks to see if Moses will come pay attention. Like, didn't God know Moses is going to come over there? So if you've seen the book Gods and Kings by Ridley Scott, like there's a whole lot of bushes that are burned up. And like, there's an interesting idea that like God kept burning bushes to get Moses's attention, but he was really slow to come over. I kind of like that idea, to be honest, because look how reticent he is to do this.
This reminds me of the Native American vision quest that we read about.
Yes.
The vision, and then coming back and being more willing, more able to minister to others.
And the key phrase he used in that book, right, is that visions are not meant to transcend spiritually. They're meant to transform you and your relationship with your own body and your own community. So good mystics don't live in the sky. They sort of go on a retreat and are more present in their body afterward. Again, the proof in the pudding when you read the Revelation of St. John, and this is why rapture theology is really bad. The New Jerusalem comes down to earth. God's home is among mortals. I mean, that's normal mysticism. People don't flee the earth to be with God. God descends to be with people. I mean, that's mysticism 101. The closer you get to God, the closer you must get to other people. And if you get closer to God and you don't get closer to other people, you didn't get closer to God. So notice what Moses does with his proximity to God. He goes to Pharaoh and says, "Let my people go."
You know, someone had to write down the experiences that Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Isaiah had. And if today, you know, one of us came out and said we had those experiences and wrote them down, I don't know what people would think.
Well, I mean, and this is a thing that we do, Kim, and I'll say this on All Saints Day, you know, we're so hesitant to call somebody a saint while they're still alive because they could still mess it up. You know, like we want to wait till they're dead and we've evaluated they weren't like horrible people, you know, because we're afraid they might still mess it up. And we tend to like look at people like honestly with rose-colored glasses. I mean, so just to be really clear, it's really important. I mean, Martin Luther King did a lot of wonderful things in the United States. I wouldn't want to have been married to him because he was a chronic philanderer. And the truth is, his philandering doesn't disqualify the good things that he did. In fact, when you hold them together, you're able to have like access to a human being just like you. It doesn't excuse his philandering by any means, right? And it doesn't taint the good things he did. It's just a good reminder, like people aren't perfect. We all make mistakes, and God seems to be at peace with that. So it would be nice if we could be at peace with that too. And so I don't mind telling you, like right now, there's a lot of things my mom does that drives me crazy, but the lady's a saint. and there's really nothing she could do at this point. Like if she became a Wiccan or like converted to like Satanism, it wouldn't disqualify her sainthood. And that's really important to say, because she's pointed me and so many other people to God, and there's no converting that. It's happened. And I think if people wrote down their call experience, you might think they were nuts. I mean, I'll tell you, I had a professor who was a missionary to the Maasai in Africa for like 20 years. And he was telling me about his call experience. One time the missionary came to church and he was listening to the missionary. And then he looked up above like the communion table and he saw in his mind, made out of fire, the word Japan. And he knew he was called to be a foreign missionary. And I was like, but you didn't go to Japan, you went to Africa. He was like, yeah, the particulars didn't matter. That was my call to ministry though. And I actually really appreciated that. That for him at the time, that's where he was most focused on. And it turned out he went to Africa. He never even visited Japan. But he didn't think twice about that being his call when he told it retroactively. He said, no, that was my call to Africa, was the word Japan in flames.
That's the question.
What, how do we know if we're called or not called, or if we're ignoring a call, or that is, that to me is so.
That's really easy. Everybody's called, period.
Everybody's called.
The church is a ministry of lay people, deacons, priests, and bishops in that order. Every person is called. Some people are called to particular roles. Some people are called to go deeper into those roles, and some people are called to supervise those roles. Everybody's called to ministry, period. Even people who aren't Christian.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask next was, can you be called to a place that is not a Christian place? I felt called as a teacher, as an educator, and that's not a church thing.
Yeah, I mean, this is like what Frederick Buechner says, your vocation is where the world's deepest need and your deepest joy connect. Being a teacher is not always joyful, but I will tell you, it's one of those like gifts that I don't think you can get away from no matter how you run. And I believe, and I could be wrong, that people who do not have the gift of teaching, you can put them in every education course possible, and they're not teachers. They can do the craft right, but they're not living into their vocation. I mean, you can't teach somebody a vocation. And when I say outside of Christian, I mean, does God call Muslim people to ministry? Absolutely. I couldn't say anything otherwise. Is God calling me to Islam? Well, I don't think so. There's some beautiful things in Islam. I mean, I wish I had the discipline our Muslim brothers and sisters do spiritually. The way that they do certain things is amazing, but it's not my call. It's not my native language, and I'll never speak it like I will speak my native language of Christianity. Darlene, please.
I don't remember being called. I don't remember hearing a voice or having a clear direction or knowing this is what I need to do or be in my life. But I've been drawn to a variety of jobs, positions, missions, causes. And as I look back on my life, there is a clear theme of nurturing others, caring, mentoring, supporting others that runs through everything I've ever done. But it wasn't a discernible call. But I think I was called.
Yeah.
Well, Darlene, remember the speaker in the film? His call was more about just listening and be ready to hear and following.
Yes.
It's not this burning bush.
Thank you.
So, maybe call means something a little different than the way he explains it.
Yes. Thank you, Herb.
I do sometimes think, for what it's worth, that we only see call retrospectively. And again, my own experience is I wasn't sure. And when I look backward, it's almost like everything fell into place. I mean, look, I don't know that God called me to St. Thomas. I don't know that, because I'll never know that. But what I do know is that all of the potential boundaries to coming here, we circumnavigated them. So, I don't, and I'm one of those people, I didn't know that, I don't believe in fatalism. I don't believe that God can only generate one perfect plan for your life, because I'm able to do troubleshooting. So surely God is. But I do think, like, you judge a fruit, you judge a tree by its fruit, right? And that sometimes things just seem to like conspire. I don't know if you've ever read the book, The Alchemist by Paulo Coelho. If you haven't, it's a very enjoyable book, right? And his line is, the universe conspires to you meeting your personal destiny. And I also hear this line, sometimes joy is an act of resistance.
Huh. Active resistance.
Mm-hmm.
That's pretty interesting. That's
how it's
pretty
different
cool.
from happiness.
Yes. Yeah.
Herb, you're on mics. What do you got for us?
Well, I kind of found that interesting, these stories. I mean, Abraham, I was always surprised when God's going to strike down God some more, and he kind of keeps begging for, or asking for relief. And that some of these, even in front of a burning bush, Moses is telling God, "Oh, I don't think it's me. You got the wrong guy." I'm thinking, if I was standing in front of a burning bush, I don't think I would say no.
And what's amazing is you might, and that's where this is so like liberating, right? I mean, like, these people who are icons of faith went kicking and screaming.
Yeah.
Thank God for that. I mean, really.
Well, and God was even willing to accommodate Moses with giving him Aaron, and so.
I just, it's so interesting to think, right, how like God's values so often don't line up with ours. Like, God is extremely inefficient. I mean, really, really inefficient. And man, that's a great challenge for me, because I loved multitasking and getting things done, and I think there's a balance between the two, to be sure. It's not like one or the other, but like, again, like, they're going to wander for 40 years. It could have taken them 40 days. There's this great rub on Mary. Like, a lot of people say, well, why did God wait so long for, to be born? And one read I really like is, well, God tried with a lot of people, and Mary was the first person who said yes. I find it very liberating that God's willing to wait instead of like taking us over. I mean, notice God never says to Moses, you have no choice in this matter. I am going to totally take control of your will and make you do what I say. Now, God's pretty firm, but Moses has to agree at some level.
Hey, Mike. Hi, y'all.
Hey, please.
Oh, sorry. Am I breaking up? Can you hear me clearly?
Yeah, you're just fine. You're good.
Okay. So this idea of like calling. I was going to tell y'all, like 2 summers ago, our church put on what's called the Calling Lab. It's called the Calling Lab. It's out of this group in Tampa, and it was really fascinating to me because I think that I stressed for a really long time, like, where is my like Moses burning bush call, and I think that I sense that a lot within, I think my dad struggles with that. Where's my call? Where's my call? And this anxiety about call, and it's interesting because all of that like makes you look at yourself. Like it's like an inward looking, you know, where's my call? Where's my call? And so one of the things about, you know, it was nice to take the course and sort of get ideas like strengths and all that kind of stuff, you know, but I think one thing I learned through that was just like you said, Mike, like it's like you don't stress about the call, you know, like just start doing, I guess. And that's more of a trust, like to just press in before you even sense that call, and be like, I don't know, but I'm just going to press in. But I noticed that when I was in this course, there was a young mom too, who was really stressed about like her purpose. She's like, before I had kids, like I knew that I was called to do this, and now I just feel like I'm floundering. And so sometimes I think that the focus on call within our the church that I was a part of, like really sent people like just like on a self-discovery thing, you know, and kind of like stunted the act of like just stepping out in faith and just serving, even though like you have no idea, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But it was a very elaborate study of calling, and it was based on what the pastor at this church, at my church, thought was like very clear, that all of us are called to be either apostles, prophets, evangelicals, shepherds, or teachers. So it's called like APEST, you know? So sort of like, I don't know. That was just an interesting course to go through with folks, and just see how there's this anxiety about like, what if I'm not following my purpose? What if I'm not following my calling, you know?
I really appreciate it. And I'm going to say something that's maybe unpopular and maybe naughty, but I'll just say, I am really not a big fan of spiritual gift inventories, because they so pigeonhole people. I mean, I think if you say like, hey, where do you see like some of your gifts and joys, but you're also open to those changing? Because the truth is, I mean, as I read the scriptures, the Spirit gives gifts to people as the Spirit decides is useful for the body. And sometimes that can all change, even within a person. And I think a lot of this is really helpful, having done the Enneagram. There are people I know who have a laser focus, and like they've got their purpose dialed in, but to tell everybody they have to be like that when they're not wired that way, I think it's like spiritual malpractice. I mean, like, what's your purpose? Your purpose is, right, to grow to love God in yourself and other people, and to produce fruits like love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, self-control. I feel like everybody is called to those purposes. How we do that, I just can't imagine there's a template you can put on top of somebody and say, here's your path. And I will say, because some people are wired that way and they write books that say everybody is, it kind of does create a little bit of spiritual paranoia, where people are like, I don't know my call. What are my gifts? Really? You don't know your gifts? Like, you need to like think about yourself a little bit more, right? I mean, like a little self-awareness would go a long way. And filling out a multiple choice bubble sheet that Rick Warren designed, it probably works for Rick Warren, but since you're not him, I can't imagine it works for you like it does for him. I don't know if that makes sense.
It's well said. I think we have this guilt feeling about being called, you know, and I don't think God wants us to feel guilty about being called, you know.
Yeah, I mean, I do think the thing to affirm, like I said to Graciela, and the prayer book says this, is we are all called to ministry, period. Now, some people, and this is where I think it's really helpful to think about the body of Christ, right? I mean, I know people who function like eyes, and I know people who function like rectums, and your body needs both of them. I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean, you know, like I know people who like, they do stewardship down to the penny. They don't want to waste anything. That's what your rectum does, and it helps you, right? I mean, but if that ruled everything else, you wouldn't be a body. You'd just be a rectum. John, you've had your hand up. Well, you took it down. Okay. I wish that there was like, I'll tell you, because I'm I'm a clergy person and I've had to do this, and we constantly try to not reinvent, but like move around. How do we do like call to ordained ministry? Because it's just really hard. It's really hard. We have all kinds of motives and guilt that involve. I mean, some people think like, oh, those people are more important. And how could we not think that when we're in a hierarchical church system? Like that is in some ways natural. And some people say, well, I could never be a missionary. That's so hard. Well, if you're called to be a missionary, it's not hard. Like that's what you're called to do. And things I don't want to do. I don't want to be an ER nurse, and I don't want to work in prison. But if you're called to do that, like that's not hard for you. And that's kind of like a way you figure it out. Like, where is my like natural joy in the world? And, I think it's really hard to reinvent this because we have such a strong cultural type. But the truth is, I'll tell you, I'm not a better person than anybody on the screen. In fact, like I know you all well enough where I'd say with high level of confidence, I mean, probably all of y'all are better people than I am, but I do feel a call to be the priest here. I mean, I think so. Some days I don't, but like, and I think this is not a hierarchy. It's just, we're called to different stuff and it can change. And we're called to exhibit the same qualities wherever we find ourselves.
You know what I like too about this calling idea is that it's not like an individualist determination. You find it in community, and just how much over the years, like personally, people have, and how we can encourage other people, but people say like, oh, you seem to be like, you like this. And sometimes, so the nurture of call, or whatever it is. But I like that too. And maybe I'll say this, but Moses, he's like, no, not a public speaker. I don't want to do this. And so God's like, okay, fine. Aaron can do, And so just that idea of it's not this like isolating individualist pursuit of serving the Lord, and it's always in community. And like, we're here to, help each other, figure that out, we're not alone. But I like that from them.
One of the things the bishop said that I really appreciate when he was in May, somebody asked him a question about Bible study. And he said, like one of the commitments we have as the Episcopal Church is that we read the Bible in community. Because when you read it by yourself, all of a sudden it's just you, and you'll find the Bible telling you all kinds of things that do not uphold the community. In like discerning call, reading scripture in community, not so that your voice is trumped, but so that it's in conversation, those seem like really important values to me. What else is going on in these readings for you, Tim?
Yes, I think I am not sure whether it was Jeremiah or Ezekiel, but God said to him, I didn't knew you before you were born.
Yeah.
Now, I have a problem kind of lining that up with God allowing things to happen, or I mean, I don't know if there is essence before existence or vice versa. And that kind of confuses me a little.
I think that, I always want to remind you of what former Bishop Gene Robinson said, like it's always important to take the Bible seriously without confusing that with taking it literally, because those are different things. And I'll tell you that often this passage gets used by people who are dead set against abortion for any means to talk about, well, look, God knows you before you're born and life begins at conception. And I don't think that's what the passage is trying to communicate. I think the passage is trying to say, God is telling Jeremiah, I probably know you better than you know yourself. And I value you. Now, look, I'm not saying you can't extrapolate some other things, but I think if we say like, oh, like, anyway, I just think that's what the passage is trying to say. And it comes with Jeremiah saying, I don't think this is what I'm called to do. And the response is, I know you better than you know yourself. I've known you before you were even an idea. And that's why this is my idea for you, because I know you. And I trust you more than you trust yourself. I mean, like, to me, that seems like what the read is really saying. And we could put a whole lot of other baggage on it. But what's interesting sometimes is actually, I feel that voice happens a lot in community. Again, I'm wary of people who internally know they're doing God's will all the time. But I do think there's interesting turns I have in community. And there's people in my life who say like, I mean, I find it hard to receive, but sometimes people say like, hey, you're clearly doing what you were born to do. And I, you know, I don't hear that voice out of heaven, but I do try to like treasure that in my heart, that other people experience what I'm doing that way. I think that's what the Jeremiah passage is about. What else came up for you guys in these readings? Questions or comments, concerns? John, please.
I did, it's just a note, it's something I noticed in the readings. And that's that in Ezekiel, God calls him son of man.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you know,
noticed it, it's not, you know, I thought it was interesting.
Yeah, I want to raise that to you because if you're familiar with the Gospels, that's how Jesus refers to himself. And it's funny, we often get this sort of backward, like we all, you know, sometimes like an unclean spirit will say, I know who you are, you're the Son of God. And we're like, oh yeah, that's because Jesus is God's son. But you know, like in the scriptures, Son of God is a phrase used throughout the Psalms for a king. And really what it means is like you clearly have like God's favor with your position. You have positional authority whereby you are supposed to be a blessing to other people. What's interesting is Jesus doesn't call himself Son of God. He calls himself, like Ezekiel, like Son of Men, right? By which I think he means like humankind. And so some people say like, oh, this is an eschatological title. And really when you hear Son of Man, it means Son of God. But that's not what it means for Ezekiel. I think what it means is you're a regular person like everybody else. Everybody on the screen is a son of human beings. And my dad had like 5 lines that I always remember. And one of his lines that I thought was really good is, you know, the minute you think you're different from everybody else is the minute you're just like everybody else. And I think that's what Son of Man means. You're just like everybody else. Called to something, maybe to a different expression of your vocation, but since we're all called, then you're just like everybody else.
Hey, Mike.
Yes, sir.
In the New Oxford and RISV, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Ezekiel, I mean, God refers to Ezekiel as the mortal.
Yes.
I don't understand that.
Well, I mean, Ezekiel's having communion with like metaphysical beings, right? Ezekiel's seeing cherubim, and Ezekiel's like in some ways seeing God's throne chariot and hearing God's voice. But it's really clear Ezekiel's not special. And maybe that's just a reminder. Again, like, you know, it's always like sometimes we say like, oh, that person's an angel. right? And angel means messenger. That's all it means. So anytime you're reading your Bible and there's an angel on the scene, that could be a human person. Gabriel could be the arch messenger, like a human person who in one or two moments speaks a message straight from God. Which means you can be an angel too. You can give a message to people who really need to hear a message from God. Sometimes that message is no. Sometimes that message is stop. Sometimes that message is, I wish you would love yourself as much as I love you. Those can all be divine messages, and you can be the bearer of those tidings. And I wish we would take that seriously so we could live into it. There's nothing wrong, I think, with like thinking about angels having wings and halos, as long as we don't talk ourselves out of the call to be God's messengers. We've constructed this whole tiered spirituality that in some ways removes responsibility from us. And I think this lesson is saying, like, no, you are responsible. You're called. God's inviting you to join God in what God's doing. And that's what the guy said on the video that I really appreciated, right? When the voice comes, here I am, send me.
I was going to say, I did enjoy, I'm freezing up. I'm sorry, guys.
You're okay.
I did enjoy the speaker, and that one last thing that he said, kind of to summarize, was just about like how, we're called still to liberate, and he mentioned all the isms, which I thought was interesting. I'm totally freezing, guys.
We can hear you though. You said he mentioned the isms. You froze on that, but you came clear enough, right? And he specifically named not only racism.
Good, you can hear me.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, good. So yeah, he mentioned all the isms. And so I thought that was interesting too, because that was a call to serve, I guess you would say, like God's character of justice, and liberating people from injustice. And so that idea of ministry, for me, that's becoming more and more all encompassing, is not just like a ministry of preaching, the word or whatever, but actually a ministry of liberating people from the isms. Does that make sense?
It does. I think it's really helpful. And in some of the isms, like, we don't mind in some of like, well, okay, like in general, if we can agree what racism is, most people are against racism if we're all on the same page with what that word means, right? But there's also things we're not always clear about, like individualism.
Mm-hmm.
And I will tell you, my last community, if I said that nationalism was idolatry or patriotism was idolatry, I had a guy threaten me for saying that, because he'd been in the Navy his whole life. But there's a difference between loving and supporting your country, right, and patriotism. Because the truth is, right, like, America and God are not the same thing.
I wonder about that with, as far as, like you said, Mike, that, examine your gifting, and I'm a real vocal person, and I'm fine with
Mary, you are
speaking
present.
out.
Yeah, Mary, you did.
Been
You might
hated. This is wrong, like speak the call on all of us to speak up about injustice, how that looks so differently. Like between what you said, the person who's the hand speaking out against injustice versus like the rectum,
Yeah.
Because I know there's some folks who, want to be like politically active and uprooting injustice. And then, others who are like, no, that's not. I'm just reflecting, just sort of on that call to continue to do the liberation work that that Moses was doing. So.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And by the way, if you ever find yourself freezing on a Zoom, you can just turn your camera off, and that usually irons out some bandwidth, right? So that your voice stays constant. You froze just a little bit, but I think I heard what you said. I really appreciate it. And again, I think that's where there's this interesting thing about moving as a body instead of as individuals, right? And I as a speaker, right, I always felt like I have this speaking gift, but there is such a thing as speaking the truth in love, right? And I'm learning from some folks right here who very much make it their practice. I'm not going to speak a criticism unless I'm going to be part of the solution. And that's, this is like helpful. It's helpful to hear how people who are natural speakers can also grow into their gifts, so that their gifts, right, maybe you're articulate, great. And then the question is, what do you articulate? Sometimes the answer is, and I think this is really interesting. Sometimes we think, I'm going to seem like I'm undermining what I just said, but, I don't think we always have to have the answer to say something's a problem.
Mm-hmm.
But I do think when we identify problems, even if we don't have the solution, if we can hold that they're problems, perhaps we can draw other people who are able to solve them when we ourselves are not. And that's some ways how we like network together to solve problems that no single person can solve.
Mm-hmm.
Herb, you're going to say something.
No, not really. I'm just listening. I'm sorry.
Okay. No, you're okay. You're okay.
Well, I will add something. This is one of my favorite lessons in this book so far. And generally speaking, when you take Bible studies, you kind of do it as a linear progression, Genesis 1, Genesis 2, Genesis 3. And here he goes through, 4 eras of the Hebrew people at different times, and shows how they're called. And you can see them in juxtaposition with each other. And it's kind of nice to see and learn from.
Yeah, I still want to come back to something we mentioned last week too, that I think is really key when we talk about call. Moses in the middle of the wilderness, it's dirt. He's on dirt. And God says, take off your shoes. And the book says, well, that's the way you treat people's homes. He's not in a home. He's on a mountain. So to me, mystically, this is about removing your armor. I mean, the shoes are a barrier between him and the ground of all being. And so the question is, what do we put between us and the ground of all being? What do we put between us and empathic or compassionate connection? And could we create some more holy ground by taking that off? I do think this is the kind of conversation, right, that, and this is what I enjoy about having these small groups, is that the people are more willing to take risks in smaller groups, to say like, I don't know about that, or what, I don't know, that passage seems really, really strange to me. And in some ways, I think that's taking our shoes off, and it makes the ground holy. And it's a hard thing to cultivate, but again, like if people in communities, whether they're synagogues or churches, were able to say, I'm really struggling as a parent right now. I think about my kids a lot, but not always positively. And somebody could make room for that instead of saying, oh, that's just a phase. or you're doing fine, or some kind of platitude, right? Like if we could take our shoes off together, well, the ground would be holy. And it doesn't just have to be in the sanctuary. It happens in homes, it happens in hearts, it happens on phone calls. And I think the way we make holy ground is we take our shoes off so that we can act, you know, like your feet are the most sensitive organ on your body. Turns out most of us don't feel much with our feet because we wear shoes all the time. So it would be really interesting to think about, how do we increase our sensitivity to others and ourselves in community? John, you got something, please.
Sorry.
Just a comment. That's, it is incredibly hard to remove your own armor. I would say at times impossible. Maybe other times not so hard, but if there's one thing that I think is difficult to do for me, and maybe for many others, it is to remove the armor. And I don't know that I'll ever be able to accomplish it.
Yeah, you know, I do think, John, there's times the armor actually serves us well, so that we have to be selective with how and when we take it off. I just wish that we could create a ground where we can take it off more often. And I will say this, if somebody takes your armor from you, that's not going to build community. So we think what we do, and this is the phrase another parishioner taught me, is something called gentle pressure relentlessly applied. And the pressure is like, hey, I'm gonna try to love you through the seams of your armor. And if I do it long enough, it might seep in. And then you might like expose your actual self a little more. And try it out so that I can keep this gentle pressure relentlessly applied. And some of that might sneak its way in. Knowing I'll mess it up sometimes, right? And then we circle back. Graciela, please.
Yes, you know, at age 80, Mike and the rest of you guys, I don't know what my armor is. I don't know what it is I take off or remove because I'm 80.
Yeah.
And I knew what to do back then when I was an educator and all of that stuff. And now I want to, but I don't know what it is or where to go, or maybe I need counseling. I don't know.
Well, we all need counseling, and we need a community that's patient and loves us as we go and helps us discern, instead of telling us, oh, Graciela, I can tell you where your armor is. I cannot tell you that. But we can listen to one another and draw things out from one another that we could never do in isolation, never. And it's a journey. And it's not like, hey, because I know what armor I'm wearing now, doesn't mean I won't invent new kinds in the future. And again, there's times I need to be armored, right? There's times where people will say things to me and they are not saying it lovingly. So it makes sense that I have some protection, right?
Yes.
That discernment about what I let in and what I let out, fortunately, doesn't just have to be me. In a community, people can say, Mike, don't let that in. Don't let that in. Okay, I have really enjoyed our conversation. This is a really fun one. Next week, I'm going to do something really naughty. I'm going to ask us to do 11 and 12 together because they make more sense to me as a block than if we just do 11 and stop. Okay, so we'll do lessons 11 and 12. It's 10 chapters. It's only 10 chapters. And I'll put that in the e-news as well, but it's lessons 11 and 12 for next Wednesday. Thank you for taking your time and taking your armor off together.
Thank you.
See you soon.